My name is Elena Brooks. I am 35 years old, female, and I live in Cleveland, Ohio, where the lake makes its own weather and the wind at the end of November slides under doors like a rumor. And my work is operations manager for a small chain of clinics on the east side, which means I keep schedules that hold, I fix problems with a calm voice, and I collect facts before I decide how I feel. And I am married to Aaron, who is a decent cook, a fast talker, and a slow changer. And for years, I have tried to be the person who steadies the cart while he learns the road. And it worked until it didn't. Which is another way to say, Thanksgiving broke something that had been cracking for a long time, and the crack started the day I drove home from a double shift on the Wednesday before the holiday, with pies in the trunk and groceries squashed into the back seat, and the sky already dark at 5, and I walked into a house that was clean because I cleaned it, quiet because I had paid the gas bill, and colder than it should be. And there on the hall table was a note in Aaron's tight, lazy handwriting that said, "Gone to Florida with Mom. Take care of Frank for me. Back. Next week." And under the note was the spare key for the upstairs lock and a set of instructions ripped from a legal pad. Things like, "Frank drinks tea at 7, and "Remind him not to smoke inside," and a line that said, "Don't overreact," which was a match slid across sand. Because I do not overreact. I plan. I set terms. I keep the engine running so everyone else can ride. And standing in my coat with my fingers stiff from the cold and my heart knocking like someone trying to get out of a locked room, I heard a soft sound from the living room, and there he was, Aaron's stepfather Frank, sitting in my chair with his boots on my ottoman, holding the remote like it owed him something, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. And he said, "Well, look who's home," like I had returned to his house instead of mine, and I set the pies on the counter and said, "Where's Aaron?" And he said, "Didn't he tell you? He flew out this afternoon. Family emergency. His mother needed him." And I said, "And you needed my chair." And he laughed and said, "Don't be touchy, kiddo," which is a thing I have been called by men who want you small. And I took off my coat and my shoes, and I moved slowly because when you move fast, people think you're emotional. And when you move slow, they make the mistake of explaining themselves. And he did. He said, "Your husband asked me to stay here so I wouldn't be alone at the apartment. My heat's out. You don't mind, do you?" And the way he said it made it not a question at all. And I said, "I mind being told instead of asked." And he said, "You ladies and your feelings." And I said, "You men and your borrowed houses." And then I walked past him to the kitchen and began to put away food, because sometimes putting cans on shelves is a way to remember you are not a guest in your own life. My world up to that point had been a set of routines that held me together. Morning coffee in a blue mug, a walk before work when the sidewalks are still soft with old leaves, a call to my sister on Tuesdays, and the belief that my marriage could be better than it was if I kept steering us back to center. But the note on the table shifted the room because it said a choice had been made without me, and the choice was to leave me with a man who calls me kiddo, who drinks without stopping, who once told me that a wife is like a good couch, decent when you get it, better when it breaks in. And while I had made peace with him at arm's length for years, I had never agreed to host him without warning on a holiday I had planned and shopped and worked for. And the problem presented itself as two pieces, the immediate and the longer. The immediate being how to get through the next 4 days without burning the house down, and the longer being how to live with a man who thought it was okay to leave me a task list and head south. I texted Aaron. I kept it simple, because simple is a mirror. "You left. Frank is here. Explain." And the dots danced and paused, and then the phone rang, and I answered because bad news should show its face. And he said, "Babe, I told you. Mom's blood pressure spiked. She needed me. Flights were insane. I grabbed one. Frank's heat is out. It's just a few days." And I said, "You told me nothing." And he said, "I left a note." And I said, "A note is not a conversation." And he said, "Don't make this a thing." And I said, "It is a thing." And in the background, I heard a woman laugh. Not his mother's laugh because she has a smoker's cough built into hers. A bright laugh. And I felt the floor tilt even though I was standing still. And I said, "Who is that?" And he said, "People in the airport." And I said, "Right." And he said, "Elena, please." And I said, "Enjoy your flight." And I hung up because I do not audition for a lie, I collect evidence. I made tea, not because I wanted to serve Frank, but because I wanted my hands to do something that wasn't hitting a wall. And I brought him a mug and set it on a coaster, because the old couch may still be a couch. And he said, "That's my girl." And I said, "I am not your anything." And I took the remote and turned off the television and said, "House rules are not suspended just because Aaron acts like he owns me." And he raised his eyebrows like a man in an old ad, and I laid out the rules in a voice I use with new hires. When they test the process, I said, "No smoking inside, no alcohol in the morning. If you are here, you clean your mess, and you do not call me names." And he said, "You got a lot of rules for someone left behind." And I said, "I have a lot of rules because I am the one who stays." And he looked at me for a long beat like he was deciding whether I had teeth, and then he nodded and said, "Fine." And we stared at each other with a small table between us like a border. That night, I changed the guest room sheets and put a towel on the bed and showed him where things were. And I locked my bedroom door and put the chair under the handle because I felt silly and also safe. And I set my phone on the nightstand and scrolled through bank activity, which I do not do out of suspicion but habit. And there it was in black and white. A ticket to Tampa paid with our joint card at 11:03 a.m. 2 seats, not one. A mid-range hotel on the beach. A rental car. All before noon. All marked non-refundable. And my heart did the quiet thing it does when it recognizes the end of a season. It did not break loud. It clocked details. It took a picture. It made a folder called Thanksgiving, and I fell asleep late and woke at 5:17 with the same folder open in my mind. Thanksgiving morning, I made coffee and a small breakfast because even battles go better with protein. And I texted my sister Nora because she is the person who asks the right question and does not try to fix me. And she replied, "Come here if you hate it there." And I said, "Not yet, I have work to do." And she sent a heart. And I made a plan on a piece of paper with lines and arrows like a simple map. And step 1 was call the gas company for Frank's apartment to check if the heat was really out. And the woman on the phone said the account was current and the heat had been on since last week. And I said thank you and crossed out the lie. And step 2 was check the thermostat here, which was set at 62 because someone had tried to make me cold as a means of control and failed. And I turned it up to 68 because I am not a martyr. And step 3 was roast a small turkey because I had bought it, and because the house would smell like effort and home. And step 4 was gather receipts, because feelings are not enough for the life I want. Frank came down at 8 in a robe that was not mine and asked if I needed him to carve later, and I said no, and he stood there rocking on his heels like a man waiting on a punchline, and then he said, "Aaron's a good boy." And I said, "He is a grown man." And he said, "He's loyal." And I said, "To whom?" And he said, "Family." And I said, "I am his family." And the way he looked away told me the whole story of how they talk about me when I am not in the room. And I put the turkey in the oven and the timer on the stove, and a timer in my head. At 10, I sat at the dining table with my laptop and opened our airline account and saw the booking again. 2 names, his and a woman named S. Hart. And the system masked the full first name, but the email confirmation gave an address with Sophie Hart in it. And I felt that hot cold again, and I took a breath, and I wrote it in the folder. And then I opened our joint bank and saw a charge yesterday at a florist for $186 and a note for the best. And if I had been a different kind of woman, I would have called and screamed. But I am the kind who will call later, calm and ask for a copy of the card imprint with a signature, and I will file it with the rest. And I will not tell you that did not hurt, because it did. It hurt in the soft place where plans live. But pain is not a plan, and plans are what I make when people think I will only cry. At noon, while I basted the turkey, the doorbell rang, and it was my friend Tasha from the clinic, holding a pie and a carton of cream like she had been assigned dessert by the universe, and she said, "You didn't answer my text, so I came." And I hugged her and said, "I am both fine and not fine." And she looked over my shoulder and saw Frank and raised eyebrows without moving her face, and I said, "You do not have to stay." And she said, "Watch me." And she sat in my kitchen and told me a story about a patient who brought a dog in a backpack, and her voice soothed the room the way salt fixes a too sweet sauce. And when she stepped outside to call her mother, Frank leaned in and said, "You gonna tell your little buddy your man went to see his ex?" And the way he said it made every part of my theory snap into place, and I turned and said, "Which ex, Frank?" And he blinked because he did not mean to say ex, he meant to say friend. And he was sloppy because he was proud. And he said, "You know, that blonde from back in college, the one he should have married, the one his mother liked." And the floor rose and fell again and came to rest. And I said, "Sophie." And he smiled like a dog that has found something it thinks you lost. And I thought, there it is, the quiet center of a loud holiday, the old story at the bottom of a new mess, and my hands did not shake. They moved the baster back into the drawer. They washed themselves. They took a dish towel and folded it in halves until it was a clean square. The day stretched like a wire between two poles. Tasha stayed until 3 and then left to see her grandmother. And Frank sulked beat for beat with the football game until I turned it off and put on music. And when the turkey was done, I made plates because I was hungry and because eating is a way to say to yourself that you still live here. And he ate like a man who has never said thank you to a meal, and after, he said, "I'll nap," which meant he would spread out on my couch. And I said, "You will nap in the guest room." And he said, "This is a good couch." And I said, "Yes, and it's not for you." And he stared at me, and I stared back. And after a long beat, he stood and muttered a word that I will not repeat here. And he went upstairs, and I locked the liquor cabinet. Not because I am cruel, but because I am not a nurse when I am off duty, and I need my evening to be quiet. Alone with my fork and my thoughts, I made the mistake of scrolling. And there they were, not on his account because he knows better, but on hers. A Sophie with a beach drink and a caption about old flames, warm holidays. And a hand in the corner of the frame that looked like Aaron's. And my hands did shake then, not like fear, but like you carry a heavy box too far, and the muscles complain after. And I put the phone face down and I went to the sink and did the dishes because water and soap fix more than plates. And when I was done, I took out my pen and I wrote a list labeled Now and Next. And under Now, I wrote, sleep, lock doors, breathe, do not call him, gather receipts. And under Next, I wrote, Banker Monday, airline call for passenger list, lawyer Tuesday, change joint card settings, check the lease for occupancy rules, because old men in robes do not get to squat in my living room while their favorite boy starts fresh on a beach. That night the house was still, and I could hear Frank snore through the vent, and I lay in the dark and felt the lowest point brush the edge of the bed, not because I was alone. I have been alone and fine, but because I had given so much of myself to a man who could leave me a note, a task, and a bill in the same hour. And I let myself cry without noise because the cat was asleep at my feet. And I did not want to teach her that my bed is for pain. And then I slept a hard sleep, like someone who has decided to finish something, and I woke with a plan already in my hands. Friday morning, I made eggs and ate mine and left a plate for Frank with a note that said, "Dishes in sink are yours." And I went to the clinic for a half day because I needed the rhythm of work. And on my lunch break, I called the bank and spoke to a woman named Carla who listened like a friend. And I asked her to freeze the joint card for any new travel expenses and to send me an itemized statement with merchant copies for the last 7 days. And she said yes, and asked if I was safe. And I said I was. And she said, "Good. Keep it that way." And I liked her voice, so I wrote her name on the folder. And I called the airline and asked for a receipt that lists passengers and the terms. And the man on the phone said he could send the itinerary, and that was it. And I thanked him and added that to the file. And then I called a lawyer whose number I had saved from a training on workplace harassment, a woman named Patel who did family and contract law. And I left a message that said, "I need an appointment for Tuesday." And I felt my feet under me again. When I came home, Frank had not done the dishes, and I stood in the doorway and watched him pretend not to notice them. And I said, "You are a guest. Or a tenant? Choose one. Guests do dishes, tenants pay and sign things." And he said, "Don't be dramatic." And I said, "Pick." And he said, "Guest." And I said, "Then wash." And he made a show of it, but he did. And I sat at the table and opened the lease for our house because my name is the one on it. And there it was, a clause about unregistered occupants and a limit of 14 days without prior notice. And I wrote the landlord an email that said, "My husband's stepfather is staying through Sunday. Unplanned. I do not plan to extend. And if you get noise complaints or anything else, call me." And the landlord replied, "Thank you for the heads up. And please remember no smoking." And I smiled because the world works better with rules and someone to enforce them. At 5, Aaron texted a photo of a sunset and a line that said, "Wish you were here." And I did not reply because I am not a prop. And at 8, after Frank fell asleep in the guest room with the TV too loud, I turned off the power strip in there because the house is mine and sleep belongs to quiet. And I took a bath and made a list called Boundaries and wrote at the top, "This is what I will not carry." And I wrote, "I will not carry his, mother's needs as a reason for my exclusion." And "I will not carry Frank." And "I will not carry the cost of his vacation." And "I will not carry a marriage on a card with my name and his signature." And then I turned off the light and slept better. Saturday was for receipts, so I drove to the florist and asked for an account copy, and the clerk looked at me with the eyes of a woman who has seen this before, and she printed me a copy without fuss, and I went to the rental car office with the reservation number from the bank statement and asked for the rental agreement because I was listed on the joint credit account. And they gave me a sanitized version, but it still had Sophie Hart's name on the driver line as an additional driver. And I took a photo and sent it to the folder. And at noon, I met my sister for soup and told her everything. And she put her hand over mine and said, "I am proud of you." And then she said, "What do you want in the end?" And I said, "I want to be respected. And if that's not possible in this marriage, I want my peace." And she nodded. And that was the whole conversation we needed about endings. Saturday night, a small thing happened that pressed the bruise harder, and it was this. Frank came down with a suitcase. Not a small bag, but a suitcase. And he put it by the door like a dog marking a tree. And he said, "Might as well settle in, kiddo. Looks like I'll be here longer than we thought." And I said, "You thought wrong." And he said, "Aaron says I can stay till New Year." And I said, "Aaron does not live here this week." And he said, You wouldn't kick out an old man. And I said, I would enforce my lease. And I texted the landlord in front of him. Confirm unregistered guest leaves Sunday evening per our call. And the landlord replied, confirmed, or I will serve notice per lease. And Frank's mouth moved like someone took away his line in a play, and he said, You are heartless. And I said, I am finished. And he stomped upstairs like a boy who thinks he can make the stairs panic. And I sat and paid the electric bill and felt nothing except the relief of a small thing done right. Sunday morning, Aaron called and I let it go to voicemail, and he left a message about love and trust and family and the word overreact again. And then at noon, he sent a text picture of a palm tree, and I blocked him for an hour because I needed to do the last part of Act 2 without interruption, which was to write him an email that laid out what I knew and what I would accept. And I wrote, You left me with your stepfather. Without asking. You used our joint funds to fly to Florida with an ex. You booked a hotel. You added her as a driver. You told me to take care of a grown man. You lied 2 times and tried to decorate the lie with urgency. And here are my terms if you intend to come home. Therapy twice a week for 3 months. Separate bank accounts by Wednesday. You pay back the travel charges in full. Frank never stays here again. You put in writing that I own half of everything we acquired after marriage and that any changes to living arrangements must be agreed to by both of us, and you apologize without the words, but, or if, and then we will see if I still want this. And I sent it, and felt like I had set down a box at the end of a long hall, and then I sent a separate email to myself with all the receipts attached, and the subject line, Thanksgiving evidence, because when you warn someone, you also protect yourself. At 5 on Sunday, Frank tried a final move. He came downstairs with his suitcase and said, Aaron says he'll be here late Monday, so I'll give you space and crash at my buddy's and be back. And I said, No, you will not be back. Your items are packed. Your robe is washed. I called you a rideshare. And if you enter this house without my consent, I will call the police and the landlord. And he said, You wouldn't. And I said, Watch me. And the car pulled up outside like a well-timed friend, and he hesitated at the door like he wanted to try another line. And I opened the door and stepped back and held my phone like a badge, and he went. And the air in the house changed. It got wider. And I stood there in my own doorway and breathed. And if that is not the lowest point to highest point yet, it was the point where the slope reversed. Because I had done the hardest thing, which is to act like you are worth your own rules. Sunday night, the house was mine again, and I made tea and called Tasha and told her the bare facts, and she said, You're safe. And I said, Yes. And I slept with my door unlocked on purpose, because fear does not get to organize my furniture. And I woke on Monday ready to move the story into the last third, where the confrontation is not a scream, but a document, a meeting, a boundary with a nameplate, and a choice you make, and then you do not back away from just because someone else is uncomfortable. Monday morning, I put on a navy sweater that makes me feel steady, and I went to work because I am good at my job, and because doing the next right thing makes the ground feel real. And at 11, I stepped into a small conference room and called Attorney Patel, and she picked up and asked me to tell her the story once without apologizing for anything, and I did. I told her about the note, the trip, the charges, the ex, the stepfather, the lease, the receipts. And when I finished, she said, Thank you for being clear. Here is what I recommend. Separate accounts now. Written demand for reimbursement on the travel and any gifts. A letter stating that any uninvited occupant is a lease violation and will be removed. And if he resists, we can file a petition for temporary support and exclusive use of the residence. And before you ask, you have standing, and you have proof. And I exhaled a long breath I did not know I was holding, and I said, I am not trying to crush him. I am trying to stop a pattern that hurts me. And she said, The law is not a hammer, it is a door. And you get to choose whether to walk through. And I said, I will walk if he keeps building walls. And she said, send me everything and I will draft the first letter today. And I thanked her and went back to work and scheduled 3 nurses for a flu clinic and restocked gloves and drank lukewarm coffee because even in the middle of a storm, my hands still know how to keep a place running. At 4, my phone buzzed with a bank alert that a refund had been requested by the hotel, but then reversed, which told me that at some point he tried to save money and then changed his mind. And at 6, I went home and the house was quiet and clean because I had made it that way. And I cooked pasta and ate at the table by the window so I could watch the street lamp flicker on like a sign that says, you are not lost, you are only turning. At 8, there was the sound of tires in the driveway, and I stood, and my heart sped up, and then slowed to something like a drum you can march to. And the door opened, and Aaron walked in with a suitcase and a smile that could have talked its way out of a flood. And then the smile faded when he saw that the locks had been rekeyed. Because yes, I had called a locksmith at lunch and had the deadbolt changed with the landlord's written okay and left his new key in an envelope taped to the door with a note that said, knock. And he held the envelope like it was a snake and said, what is this? And I said, it is a boundary with screws. And he said, you are doing the most. And I said, no, I am doing the minimum required to feel safe. And he rolled the suitcase in and looked around like the furniture might tell him which lines he should try. And I gestured to the kitchen table and said, sit. And he did. And he started with the softest spin. He said, I am sorry for the timing. Mom really needed me. And I raised a hand and said, stop. And he blinked because I do not interrupt often. And I said, your mother did not need you at a beach hotel with your ex. And he said, that is not what you think. And I said, what I think is that the rental car contract lists you and Sophie as drivers, and the airline lists 2 seats, and the florist took your card for a bouquet, and the hotel charges include 2 guest breakfasts, and there is a photo of a drink on a balcony and a hand that is yours. And he looked at the table and said, I can explain. And I said, do not insult me. Explain to yourself why you left me with your stepfather without asking, and then took my money to go on a trip. And his jaw worked like he was chewing on a nail, and he tried a new angle. He said, I panicked. I was scared. The last few months have been hard, and Sophie reached out and said she could talk to me without judgment, and things just snowballed. And I said, you do not slip and fall onto a plane, you book it. And you do not snowball into a queen bed, you choose it. And he flushed and said, it was 1 mistake. And I said, it was 5 choices. And I slid the printed letter from Attorney Patel across the table and said, here are mine. And he read the list. Therapy, separate accounts, repayment, no franc, written respect. And his mouth twisted and he said, you made this legal. And I said, I made this clear. And he said, you always loved your lists. And I said, lists have saved your life more times than you know. And we were quiet and the refrigerator hum filled the room. And then he said, what if I say no? And I said, then you should find somewhere else to sleep. And he said, this is my house too. And I said, it is our house, and I am protecting it. And he leaned back and stared at the ceiling like it had a better audience. And then he said, fine, fine. I will do therapy. I will pay back the charges. I will tell Frank to stay away. Can we just move on? And I said, the words are not enough. I need actions with dates. And he said, you want me to calendar my remorse. And I said, I want you to honor commitments the way you honor trips. And he laughed without humor and said, you are cold. And I said, I am not cold. I am done bleeding my warmth into a hole. and he flinched like the sentence had teeth. And then he said, "Okay, I will prove it." And for the first time that night, I believed he might try for a week, maybe a month. And I also believed that the truth would show up, and I did not need to chase it with a net. Tuesday, we went to the bank together and closed the joint card and opened 2 separate accounts and set the mortgage to auto-debit half from each. And the banker did not look surprised because the banker sees marriages in numbers long before we see them in words. And we left with a folder and a set of agreements. And Aaron was quiet in the car. And I let the quiet sit because quiet is honest. And after that, we went to a therapist's office in a brick building that smells like carpet and peppermint. And Aaron filled out the intake form, and the therapist asked us both to talk about what we wanted, and I said respect. And he said to be understood. And the therapist nodded and said, "Those are not opposites if both of you are telling the truth." And we scheduled 2 sessions a week for him and one for the two of us. And I walked out into cold, bright winter light and felt like I was holding a heavy pack with good straps, not a sack that rips in the parking lot. On Wednesday, I received an email from Patel that she had sent a demand letter to Aaron for reimbursement with a timeline, and that she had drafted a letter for the landlord confirming that no unapproved occupant would return, and she had also prepared a simple agreement for him to sign acknowledging equal ownership of property acquired after marriage, and that if he refused, we could petition the court. And I forwarded it to him, and he did not reply for 2 hours. And then he sent, "I will sign." And I stared at the words and thought about the difference between compliance and change. And I reminded myself that I do not need to predict. I only need to protect. Thursday night, I was making soup when my phone buzzed with a number I did not know, and a voice said, "This is Sophie." And I said, "What do you need?" And she said, "I wanted to apologize." And I said, "For what? In your own words." And she said, "For inserting myself into your marriage and letting him pretend this was harmless." And I said, "Did he tell you I did not exist?" And she said, "He told me you were taking a break." And I said, "We were not." And she was quiet and then said, "I figured that out when I saw the note about the stepfather on his counter." And the word counter clicked like a lock. And I said, "You were at my house." And she said, "No, his apartment from before you moved in together." And I realized then that some of the ghosts I had been fighting were not new, but leftovers. And I said, "Thank you for the apology. Do not contact him again." And she said, "I won't." And she hung up, and I stood with the spoon in my hand and thought about how often trouble looks like a person saying I did not know better when they had every chance to know. And then the soup boiled, and I turned down the flame, because the point of dinner is to eat, not to stir. For 2 weeks, Aaron did the things on the list. He went to therapy. He returned the travel charges in 2 payments. He texted Frank and told him not to come by, and he copied me. He signed the property paper. He brought home groceries and cooked once without acting like a hero for frying onions. And for 2 weeks, I slept like a person in a guest room of her own life. My bag half packed under the bed in case I needed to go. Not because I planned to run, but because readiness calms me. And on the 15th day, he came home late with a smell that was not his. Not perfume exactly, but a hotel lobby smell. And my stomach went cold completely. And I said, "Where were you?" And he said, "Work ran long." And I said, "Show me." And he said, "What am I? A suspect." And I said, "You are a man on probation in his own house." And he glared and said, "This is insane." And I said, "That is not an answer." And he stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door, and the slam told me more than any text could. And I sat at the table, and I pulled out the folder, and I laid everything out. And I said out loud to an empty room, "I am not going to do this for 10 more years." And the air felt different. And that night I slept with my eyes open in my mind. The next day, I took the morning off and met Patel in her office, A tidy room with 2 plants and a window that looks at a brick wall, because a lot of the law is not about views, but about light you can count on. And I said, I think I am done. And she said, say the sentence the way you want the judge to hear it. And I said, I am asking for a legal separation with exclusive use of the residence and a fair division of assets. And she said, and why? And I said, infidelity, financial misconduct, and abandonment during a major holiday. And she nodded and said, you are ready. And she filed the first papers while I watched. And the cursor blinked like a second hand. And when we left, I felt both wrecked and free, which is a feeling people do not warn you about because it does not fit into a neat story. But it is the real one. The one where the cost and the gain are twins. That night, Aaron tried to be sweet. He brought home my favorite bakery box and flowers, and I set them aside because sugar and petals do not patch holes in a roof. And I told him I had filed. And his face did a thing like a child whose favorite toy got taken away. And then anger bloomed. And he said, over a trip. And I said, over a pattern. And he said, over my family. And I said, over your choices. And he said, you think you're better than me. And I said, I think I'm better to me. And he closed his eyes like the light hurt and said, what do you want me to say? And I said, nothing. I want you to sign what's fair and be kind on your way out. And he laughed sharp and said, you'll miss me. And I said, I will miss who I thought you were. And I opened the window because the room needed air, and he stared at me like I had turned into someone he did not recognize. And he was right. I had. The days after that were paperwork and ordinary errands. I refilled prescriptions and bought cat litter and went to work, and told no one except Tasha and Nora. And at night I watched shows that made me laugh without being mean, and Aaron slept in the guest room and talked less. And after a week, he moved into a small furnished place near his old apartment. And when he left, I did not stand at the window. I wiped down the counters and changed the sheets, and sat on the couch and let the quiet settle like snow. And I cried for the girl who kept fixing things, and I thanked the woman who stopped. You wanted a climax, and here it is. The day he signed the separation agreement was a Tuesday in late January, the sky white and flat like paper. We met at Patel's office with his attorney, a man who looked tired of men like Aaron, and we reviewed the terms, and he tried to haggle over a chair and a television, and I let the lawyers talk, and then I said, the chair is mine, the television is yours. And he looked surprised because pettiness is a luxury I do not buy. And then he signed. And I signed. And the pens made a small scratch that sounded like a lock opening somewhere I could not see. And afterward he asked if we could talk alone. And I agreed because I am not afraid of a person I am done with. And in the hallway he said, I never meant to hurt you. And I said, then stop. And he said, there was a time you loved me. And I said, there is a time I loved who you were with me. And he said, maybe we can try again later. And I said, maybe you can try again with yourself. And he said, you always were cold. And I said, no, I am a lake in winter, solid enough to stand on. And he shook his head and walked away. And I stood there and slid the folder into my bag and felt lighter by exactly the weight of his name. The consequence that followed was not fireworks, but a series of small mercies. The first was sleep. The second was the way my house began to smell like what I cooked, and not like worry. The third was the text from my landlord saying, I'm glad you're all right. The fourth was a note from Carla at the bank checking in. The fifth was Tasha dropping off a plant and labeling it with a sticker that said, grow anyway. And the quiet twist you asked for came 1 week later in the form of a handwritten letter in an old man's scratch. It was from Frank, and it said, Elena, I never liked you because you made me feel like a lazy man. I am sorry I made your house feel unsafe. I am going to a program at the VA, and I will not come around again unless invited. And if you ever need me to testify that Aaron left you with me as a way to get what he wanted, I will tell that truth. And I read it twice because I could not see the Frank I knew writing that. And maybe he didn't. Maybe someone at the VA helped him. Or maybe he saw himself and did not like the view. But either way, I put the letter in the folder and labeled it forgiveness. Not for him yet, but for me. So that I do not harden in ways that make my life smaller. Spring came late, the way it does by the lake, and with it came a new normal that you asked me to show you. It looked like Saturday mornings at a market with Nora, where we bought asparagus too early and laughed about it over eggs. It looked like a small table I refinished by myself. It looked like a calendar with blank days that stayed blank until I filled them with what I wanted. It looked like my cat learning to nap in the sun again, instead of on the threshold like a guard. It looked like me taking a solo drive to Hocking Hills and hiking under cliffs that hold their own weight, and thinking, so do I. It looked like paying bills and realizing there is enough. Because I am not funding someone else's crisis. It looked like opening the hall closet and finding my own coat, and not a robe that smelled like someone else's smoke. It looked like my phone buzzing and not flinching. It looked like meeting friends for cheap pizza and laughing until I cried. It looked like standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday night and feeling safe from the front door to the back. And if you want one more turn of the plot, here it is. The Thanksgiving after all of this. I took the day off and made a small turkey again. Not because I am sentimental, but because I like the way a house smells when you roast one. And at 2 in the afternoon there was a knock, and it was a courier with an envelope from a law office in Tampa. Inside was a copy of a marriage license for Aaron and someone named Hart, dated last week, and a note from the clerk saying my certified copy request had been fulfilled, which is a thing Patel suggested I request, so that if he tried to claim we were reconciling while marrying someone else, the dates would tell their own story. And I put the paper in the folder labeled Thanksgiving Evidence, added a new tab called After, and I sat with my plate and I ate, and I did not cry. I did not feel small. I felt exactly my size, and I said out loud to a quiet room, "May they be happy without me." And I meant it. And then I called Nora and told her to come over with whatever she had, and we ate in our socks and watched a movie that ends with the good people walking down a street brighter than the one they started on. And when the credits rolled, I stood at the window and looked out at the lake, and I thought about the woman who walked into her house a year ago and found a note and a stepfather, and a silence so loud it hurt. And I whispered to her, "You did not overreact. You acted. You drew a line and then you kept it. You stopped carrying someone else's laziness like it was your duty. You learned that a plan is a kind of love for yourself. And you made one. And you followed it home. If there is a moral, let it be this. When someone leaves you with their mess and calls it an emergency, you are allowed to hand it back. When someone tries to spend your money on a life that does not include you, you are allowed to close the account. When someone tries to bring their bad habits into your living room, you are allowed to enforce your lease and your peace. And if someone tells you that you are cold for not melting on command, remember lakes in winter and how they keep whole towns standing. Remember that stillness is not empty. It is strength. And when the thaw comes, as it always does, the water runs clear. Now I wake before the sun most days and walk past the last patches of snow on the sidewalk, and I listen to my shoes on the pavement, and I count my breaths. And when I reach 10, I start again. And if I pass a window and see my reflection, I nod to her like we share a secret. Because we do. The secret that you can end a story without ending yourself. And that sometimes the best revenge is not a speech or a scene, but a life arranged so carefully around your own worth that the people who tried to break you have to watch you thrive from outside a door that they no longer have a key for. And if that sounds simple, it is. And if it sounds rare, it is that too. But it is mine, and it is enough.